Well, for those of you out there watching, whether it's recorded or live, welcome to our next conversation around the primal power of the wild, sovereignty and stewardship, and everything in between, including the archetypal forces that shape this world. And I think today we're going to kick things off by talking about what's at the tip of the spear around sovereignty, which is politics.
Which is crazy to say. I mean, obviously in the world that, I live in, which is a bubble, and I'm sure normal people would say I'm, completely out of touch, whatever normal means, right? Or even like people that um you know, they have like a big stake in it, right? So if you're a property owner or homeowner or like you have a family and you're in your local government, obviously politics is really important because it's directly affecting you a lot of the time. But I was telling you right before we hit record, you know, I I'm a binge researcher, student investigator. It's in my human design. I'm at the one line, I'm 5'1", so I love to investigate everything. And politics is interesting to me because I do follow financial markets pretty closely. It's crazy. I mean, before Trump, it was pretty intense already, right? So like people wanted to shit on Joe Biden or praise him all the time, and everyone was afraid of Trump. And this idea of like Nazism or fascism is now like top of mind. You want to talk about sovereignty? I mean, that's a
Yeah.
huge topic by itself. But I feel like, yeah, since Trump's been elected, so since November, here we are halfway through May, so it's been like 7 months. The news cycle, people's consciousness, attention, which, that's where I want to take this conversation, is this very much is a imagination game, which is I Magi Nation, right? The Magi's of the nations of the powers that shouldn't be are manipulating, controlling intelligence, creativity, attention, imagination, right? And politics is the biggest siphoner of that. The other biggest thing I see most energy and attention going to, of course, is AI, which is really fascinating. I recently watched Transcendence. It's kind of a shitty movie, even though the director is amazing. It's with Johnny Depp, and basically, this is like in 2007 or something. Johnny Depp dies, and they upload his conscious into his computer, and he becomes a super intelligent, sentient AI, and is going to destroy the world. And it's kind of like the dystopian vision of AI. If AI gets out of control, what will it do? Blah blah blah. And now AI is everywhere all the time. And then back to politics, much of the news aggregator sites, so they're showing AI or media stories to everyone, are being filtered through, large language models. So we have this very interesting time in history where so much attention, and I'd argue sovereignty, is being captured by these narratives at scale using godlike tech, which is like, whoa.
Mhm.
It's kind of hard to even wrap your mind around because there's so many like moving pieces, but yeah, that's where we can kick it off. Curious your thoughts on all that.
I mean, I don't follow politics very much, but I look at the larger meta narratives. And as far as moving pieces with politics, it always seems like they're diverting the sovereignty of our attention from like one thing to another to keep our minds off what is actually happening. And so recently, I was using AI to be like, okay, what's happening in the world of politics right now? What's a current event that we could possibly speak to? And lo and behold, Mr. Bernie Sanders is back at it. He's got this Fighting the Oligarchy tour with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And this sounds great because they're pushing to reduce corporate influence in politics. And most people would agree, depending upon or not even related to their political stance, that yeah, corporations hold a lot of power and they want to like get their money and their freedom back. And so this looks good on paper, but I would argue even if Sanders did call enough support to get into office, things wouldn't change. It's just like they're still feeding people what they want to hear. We're going to give you your freedom back because we're going to take the corporations out of politics. But I don't know, man. It doesn't even smell right to me.
It's funny. I was listening to Jordan Peterson just went back on Rogan recently, like a month ago or something, and like the great irony of like Bernie Sanders and what's her name AOC doing this fight the oligarchy tour. They're doing that tour in private jets and like with security guards and like they are the oligarchy. Like an oligarchy is a privileged, noble, like landed class that has political power. You know, that's not something new. That's like how nations have always been run. Bernie Sanders is a member of the oligarchy. Now he's running the angle, which is interesting. You know, we are in an interesting time where, you know, if you watch the inauguration of Trump, which I actually watched it, I guess I'm becoming my dad, and like all of our dads were like, I'm never gonna like politics, and then like here I am like watching politics. For me, it's one of the greatest shows on earth if you see it for what it is. I mean,
It's
it's
theater,
very
man.
it's theater, yeah. It's a circus, and it's entertainment for me. It's also educational, and I think it's important to understand how it works. But if you watch the inauguration, it's like Trump standing there with his son and his family, and then it's Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and like a bunch of other moguls that, you know, control billions and billions of dollars. I think Larry Fink was there. He's BlackRock's guy. You know, BlackRock has, you know, 12 trillion assets under management. Um, so we are seeing like the business class of hyper rich oligarchs teaming up with the right in politics. And obviously the left, like Bernie and AOC, are like, this is bad. We can't have this. Money's running the government. You know, which is so interesting because it is like, I forget the writer. It was some Jewish writer in Russia. You know, when Stalin was persecuting the Jews, and he's basically like, you know, tell me what the Soviets, you know, say the Jews are culpable for, and I'll show you what they're culpable for. It's an old tactic where you call out the very thing you're doing in your opponent, and it's like a double whammy. You virtue signal, so you look like the good guy, and then you also call them out on something that makes them look bad, but then you can do that on the back end in a more secretive, deceptive way. You know, this is unfortunately kind of how the game is played.
One thing that I was just thinking about in the whole formation of like politics, as far as I can tell, when a community is in sovereignty, they have a council, right, where power is shared in a circle, and everyone in the circle holds a particular role, position, due to their wisdom, and due to being like recognized for that wisdom because of their sovereignty and skill and wisdom in a certain space. And now we don't have council. We have like a senate, but that's also so far removed. Like everything is so disconnected from the people that are actually being affected. I don't think it's even possible for governments at this scale to allow for sovereignty to any degree. And so I was just thinking, like, has there ever been in the history of the United States, like, any sort of government or community representation that really had this council feature in place? Like, even the Declaration of Independence was kind of penned by those in power. I mean, you could argue that they were representing the people's needs, but even then, it seemed like it was a far cry.
Yeah. I mean, what's really fascinating about this is like the sovereign discussion of like how sovereignty is wielded in the West, right? The Western tradition, which is like Greco-Roman, you know, through the British Empire, the American Empire, whatever. You can draw a lineage. It goes back thousands of years. The last democracy, because democracy literally means rule of the people, right? Demos in Greek. I actually looked this up to make sure. So I'm pretty sure that's the root of democracy. Um, the last time that actually happened was in Athens and like Sparta, the city states, Macedon. So yeah, actually, demos is the populace as a political unit. So it's actually not even like each individual person. Demos is like the whole group of citizens is the demos, democracy. They rule as a unit, as a collective, which is interesting because it's not about individuals, which is a whole nother sovereignty conversation.
Planet or moon called Deimos? I'm just
Yeah,
going on a tangent now,
yeah, I'm pretty
connecting
sure.
everything.
Might be one of Saturn or Jupiter's moons. Um,
Interesting.
it's a fun fact. But no, like these city states, so like Athens, Sparta, Macedon, you know, Crete, I think, like all these like city states in the Greco-Roman era or the Greek era, the Hellenic era, they were a city and a state, and literally everyone would gather in the town square, whoever wanted to, everyone didn't have to. I'm sure a lot of people opted out. And they would sit there and hash it out, maybe even brawl, beat the shit out of each other, talk shit, have huge debates. Orators would step up to get things done, and then there'd be a majority vote. You know, that's what a democracy is. Rome wasn't a democracy. America's not a democracy. We're republics. We're representative republics. A republic is that, but at scale. And instead of all the people doing it, the people are like, hey, this guy is our representative. So he represents us in a republic democracy.
Hmm.
It's funny because we use the word democracy as
Yeah,
Americans.
but it's
It's
not the
not a
same.
democracy. It's never been a democracy. Even in 1776, it was a republic.
Hmm. And this whole idea of people coming together and like really hashing it out as a community and letting there be brawls, like it feels like a classic symposium style of
Right.
working things out. It's so funny. It's just like might be a bit of a tangent, but it reminds me of what I was just listening to in the Emerald podcast recently. It was a podcast like on war, and back in these old civilizations, like when they went to war, this was like pre-agricultural time, so it wasn't about possession or ownership. It was about like safety and tribal welfare. You know, the people would even war within their own communities, but it was healthy for people to be in touch with this visceral need to like be heard and to be felt and to express what was going on for them, the impact of what was happening in their community. And so they would brawl, they would have these wild fights, but they would also like prepare for it. They would bring themselves into a state sometimes of like a bit of a frenzy or ecstasis. And afterwards, they would decommission this energy through ritual. And like it was politics was ritualized. You know, there was deep connection to spirit and nature involved. That I think is the big difference here, and specifically in pre-agricultural times. And now war is just something that's like people are programmed into a certain mind state and they're not decommissioned from it. They become a certain tool and they lack, they're stripped of their sovereignty to enact their will in order to strive for what's best for their community. It's just like so many degrees of separation once again. So like this is why it comes down to these conversations like man to man, one on one, talking about how to reclaim our own personal power because it has to start here. A lot of people talk about you have to get into the system to change it. I mean, to a degree, I guess it makes sense. You have to understand it for sure. But I don't think there's any sort of cabal of like righteous human beings that are going to infiltrate the government as it stands and enact any long-standing change. I think right now what needs to happen is in feels more in essence of like creating these sovereign sorts of city states in a way. And I think city state's the wrong word entirely, but like that actually is possible too. If you own an island, you can create your own republic in some way or democracy or just
Right.
civilization. This is why people like myself are finding themselves in the jungle and like everyone's talking about being free and creating their own piece of land that everything comes to them that they need and trying to get away from the systems of like financial oppression and create their own banks or crypto. This is why these conversations are so enthralling to many people. And like at the high level, it's like, yeah, people get it. They want to be like away from corporations and away from banks. And at that mental level, it feels good. But what's deeper underneath is this visceral primal call to being able to fully own your experience in life with people that want the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the primeval or primal ancient idea, which is why we were in clans or tribes. It was all based on bloodlines and survival and affinity. Like you would team up with people you were born and raised with, form small groups, and you'd have councils and like a culture of decision making or consensus. This is like the hardest part about group sovereignty is consensus. How do we get to consensus? Consensus doesn't mean every single person agrees because that's probably never going to happen, right? That will probably only happen if it's like, hey, another tribe's going to come and kill all of us. Then you can get some consensus, right? It's like, well, we all agree we don't want that. But usually consensus has to go with a majority. Now, the problem with this is actually interesting. I mean, I started a university as a political science major. I thought I wanted to do law. Quickly realized that was not the case, switched to psychology and philosophy. Thus, here we are. But in my freshman year, I had to read all of the Federalist Papers. So this is basically when they're writing the Constitution, creating the U.S. government. There were factions of like Federalists, Anti-Federalists. They had this whole debate, And these guys were really smart. They studied the Native Americans. Like Benjamin Franklin could speak Iroquois, and like Thomas Jefferson like was like trading and friends with I think the Iroquois and another tribe in New England. And they studied Europe, right? They'd come from the monarchies and all that. Another, similar to Greece, Italy had city states. So, like Milan, Venice, Florence in the Middle Ages were also city state models and free cities of trade and sovereignty. So, there were models like that existed that they could draw on. But the problem is, A, factions form no matter what. So, when factions form, it's like an interest group. And today, this is at an extreme level, right?
Yeah.
Corporations, the woke community, the LGBT community, the business community, they all have their own interests and they act self-interested, right? Which is natural. I mean, it's really hard to avoid this. But the problem with consensus majority minority is like, say you get 51%, right? The minimum majority. Well, 49% of people are going to be unhappy with that decision. So it's not actually a great decision model. And there's like some thinkers, I want to say Richard Rudd, the Gene Keys author. I don't know if it's him, but someone where they're like 51% doesn't work. You actually have to have something closer to 60, 70, 80% to maintain homeostasis or equilibrium. And you have to keep deliberating or counseling until you get that, even if you have to make concessions or compromises. Because, like, perfect example, Trump, he won both votes, popular and electoral. All the people that didn't vote for him are not only like, well, we lost, they're pissed and they think he's like Hitler, some of them, right? Which is pretty crazy. So it actually destabilizes the society, even though a democratic process of free will, which that's something we haven't talked about. The ultimate like root of all this for me with sovereignty or choice is it comes to free will
Mm.
or will itself, and no one wants their will, their intention, their desire to be controlled or influenced, which is why it's so tricky when groups of people come together to make a decision that affects everyone, i.e., politics, religion, whatever, cults, communities, permaculture farms. It doesn't meet everyone's needs. And so then we go to Maslow's hierarchy. If your base needs aren't being met or your social cultural needs, you have instability and then you have resentment and you have bitterness and then you have conflict. And this is kind of the story of humanity. Yuval Harari writes about this, which I don't think he's a good guy. I don't really like his views. He believes in like depopulation and stuff if you watch his talks. But he is a brilliant guy and he talks about, basically humanity and government and culture and all this stuff, banking, money. It's all solving the coordination problem. And the coordination problem is how do you coordinate a bunch of people, labor, resources, and decisions towards life, affirming goals or survival, basically. That's the problem all this is trying to solve. How do we coordinate all the people and do the thing? This is why tyranny is so easy. And logically, if you go pure cold logic without your heart, it makes sense. It's like, well, the people can't figure any of this shit out, so let's just tyrannically tell them what to do. And it solves the coordination problem temporarily. Obviously, you then create a rebellion or resistance, but tyranny is a very popular model throughout history to solve this problem.
And that explains why a country the size of the United States, or like even China, for example, can be governed by so few. Because otherwise, you wouldn't be able to get everyone's best interests in mind. There is no way you manage that many people who are in touch with their free will. And so this reminds me of this concept that's been like coming back around to me. Like, what's really important here? It's this idea of like willpower. And this is very Nietzschean in a way, but he's really got it nailed there that this is the sort of the sort of like essential energy we need to tap into to create like reclaiming our will to be who we are, to get what we want, and without fear of being subjugated. And this sort of tyranny has been going on for so long. For most people, it's not even an option to think in this way, right? Willpower. It's
Well,
a
the
powerful
the
concept.
problem I think with history, as Aldous Huxley said, I'm just like a quote machine right now, but the problem with history is that men do not learn the lessons of history, or the lesson of history is that men do not learn the lessons of history. We've been looping, if you go out on a grand scale, we've been looping in this conversation between power and power over, right? Power with and power over. Or if you want to go into the Hegelian dialectic, it's like the master slave dialogue. Um, the masters or those in power are continually like, some of them have good intentions, right? They're like, hey, you guys can't do all this on your own. We have the military, we got the money. We're going to do it for you, and here's some rules, and then everyone's going to prosper, right? Which, has happened every once in a while in history. And not all tyrants are bad. You know, I guess definitionally a tyrant is bad, but there are tyrants that created prosperity. If you say that's, worth it, which I don't think it is, but those people at the time probably were better off than others. Um, this dialogue though, like as soon as people self-organize, and it doesn't mean you need to start like a revolution and go get all your friends to vote for someone else. That's how people politically do it, which I think is probably futile at worst. At best, it's very like polarizing. It's literally like self-sufficiency, self-sovereignty, which is why, like many people there in the Pura Vida, they want their own power, they want their own money and banking, they want their own food and resources, they want their own housing that's not tied to a government or social entity per se, even though that's kind of impossible because you still have to do contracts with the government and the country you're in, whatever, and the landholders. But once you unplug and you're not dependent, you just self-organize, and then the government can come in and say, hey, you owe us this much money, or we need you to do this, or we need you to move and do that. You need to move your business or your people here. And you can say, well, no, I'm not going to do that within the confines of the law, because there's contracts and, there's common law, there's maritime law, there's lawful versus legal. That's a whole nother rabbit hole. I don't know if you've gotten into some of that stuff, but, there's a whole nother world where everything we're doing is a contract of consent. Your birth certificate is a contract, by the way, if you were
Or
born in the
that.
West. That's a
Yeah.
whole rabbit hole, too. It's all contracts and consent, which we talked about, I think, in the last stream. This is how the black magic is done. It has to be above board and consent has to be given. Now, when it's above board, it can still be disguised, which is the fucking tricky part, because people often consent without realizing it, which is a lot of people, myself and you included. We've consented to a lot of things. We maybe didn't think we had a choice. We did have a choice, but that choice was not easy or simple. It was very complex or required resources or knowledge. Now, this could happen very easily if one community stood the test of time, stood up, and self organized in a successful way. That model would instantly be created for everyone else.
So where's an example of that? Like I want to really bring this
No,
home and
totally. And I the
look at.
problem with this is, and I've asked this question on my Facebook page and had a shitload of comments. People even criticizing me, saying, "This is bullshit, man. You're just ignorant. Look at this community; they did it." And then, of course, they drop their link with their affiliate link. A lot of people think they've done it, but my kind of like Occam's razor logic here is like if someone had successfully done it, a lot of people would have done it because the model would be proven. I think there's a lot of people working on it and getting very close and maybe even having some success. Like Tamara is a classic example in Portugal. This is
Ah,
a
this
40,
place.
50-year, going intentional community. Now they're into polyamory and, free love and stuff, but they've worked because they have very strong council models and consensus mechanics and, self individual sovereignty and protection and good communication, blah, blah, blah. And they've stood the test of time. There's Damanhur in Italy. There's Findhorn, which I hear is in decline in Scotland. There's some OG conscious, intentional communities, let's say. And there's tons up and coming. Like you and I know probably 30, 50 people that are doing projects like this right now in Costa Rica and Uruguay, Paraguay, the US, Europe, whatever. Now, the issue is, again, and I've talked about this ad nauseum, the top three things that tank those communities are founder vision disagreements, financial issues, or sexual issues. Because any one of those, and God forbid a combination, destroys the harmony of the community. And then it's just so easy to go right back into the matrix of the existing consensus models of sovereignty, i.e., well, if this community didn't work out, I'm just going to go back to living wherever and get a job and, be a citizen of whatever state. The Network State, Balaji, an amazing book that I recommend to everyone. You can get it free online. Has a lot of interesting models how to move around this with technology, specifically blockchain technology, the internet, um, basically location independent mastermind networks of people who have wealth, who want to invest and buy land, create self sovereignty, custody their own assets, whether that's land, crypto, gold, silver, wealth, real estate. And a lot of people are interested in this idea. And I'd say a shitload of people in our kind of sphere are, which is just tells us that that's where nature naturally wants to go. That's how I
Yeah.
would make that claim. Nature naturally wants us to decentralize and go in the sovereign direction because it's so clear now more than ever in 2025, it's May 19th, that the existing model doesn't work. It's not working. It's working in the sense that it's still going, but it's
Mhm.
not serving the human spirit if we want to go down that path.
So what I'm not curious about is there are these examples of places like you mentioned that are doing it and they're still failing because of relationships, money, sex, power. And these are like incredibly fundamental things that historically virtuous people didn't really have to contend with. Like I would imagine that those who are truly in sovereign ways of living, they've figured these like interpersonal things out. And so maybe this is a good time to detour it into how we can best look at how we are not fit to be doing this. What needs to come first? I know you work a lot in relationships, so I'm assuming that in our work, in our romantic relationships, we can get a really good look at if we are actually ready to start doing this work to build these communities, right? Because if we're not in good relationship with our partners, then how are we going to build a community?
Bingo. I don't know where this idea came from. I've always like liked it and kind of stored it in my brain. Um, but there's an idea that like the best community would be run by a council of couples who had stood the test of time and were in like a very powerful form of
You
unconditional
heard that
love.
somewhere?
Yeah, I don't know. I always ask around. I don't know whose idea this was. Maybe it was just like one of
Hmm.
those late nights at like a retreat or festival and someone was riffing about it around the fire. But,
Yeah, that
I've
makes
always
sense.
thought about that because, ideally the divine sovereign, and this is what's interesting about Christianity and all the monotheistic religions, it's just a dude. It's like God the Father, that's it. What about
Yeah.
God the Mother? What about the goddess, the divine mother, which has been
Hmm.
kind of deleted from history? This is something my lady, she's writing a book right now, all about goddess religion and the feminine in religion and history. And like, the Gnostics had this, the Egyptians had this. There's a bunch that had this. Zoroastrians. Um, Women could hold positions of political and religious power in a lot of these older traditions. And to me, it makes a lot of sense that the couple, which is kind of like, you want to talk about alchemy and like the hieros gamos of alchemy, right? The masculine, feminine. That's the building blocks of life, right? Yin and yang, king and queen, you know, father sky, mother earth, Gaia and Uranus. It's in all the myths. That makes a lot of sense that we'd have a dual ruler because someone does have to rule. That's a whole nother discussion, right? There's not going to be a successful society where there isn't a leader or like tribal chieftain. Now, the difference is the leader should always be like the biggest servant and the most humble and wise.
Right.
I would
Stewardship.
hope, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the problem with tyranny is like those with the most strength or military power or cunning often take power in human history, not because there weren't really powerful, wise, humble people, but because those people were killed, suppressed, or didn't want power.
I mean, that's even true in council. Like, there's a circle, but there is someone who, like, I wouldn't say has veto power, but they're still a leader in some way.
There
And
has
you're
to
right.
be a facilitator of some kind, right?
Yeah.
And that's just natural in dominance hierarchies in nature, right? There's an alpha, there's a leader, there's a matriarch, there's a patriarch, sometimes both.
But what really
Chimpanzee
denoted,
troops have both. They have a matriarch and a patriarch.
and from what I understand in these councils, that person who sat in that seat of power, we could say, you know, they didn't really always choose it. It's like there was something that they
No,
were chosen is because they had the strongest relationship with what the community would call God.
Yeah. And also, like, the person who doesn't want power is often the best choice to give the power.
Just like in Dune.
Exactly. You know, Lisan Al Gaib is a great story of this, and also the dangers of it, because then the power can still be, overwhelming and overrun everything. But yeah, the council model is very interesting. This is what all the indigenous people around the world did. They didn't elect a king or queen. I mean, some did, right? But they were influenced by colonialism or empires later. All the ancient ones, from what we know, right? It's all oral tradition. They didn't leave us a Bible to read and, give us all the rules. It was all councils, usually the elders, right? So it was the old wizened shamans, medicine men, medicine women, chieftains, warriors. These are the people that sit in council. They listen more than they speak, ideally, and they listen to spirit, right? There's always a council seat, even in some, North American, Native American. It's like there's an empty seat for spirit. It's like
Yeah.
spirit's part of the council. God, the creator, is part of the council. It's not just a bunch of us being like, all right, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do there. One of my favorite is, I think it's the Iroquois again. There's a council of grandfathers and a council of grandmothers. The council of grandmothers are the ones who decide if we should go to war, which I thought was so wise, right? It's like the men didn't actually get to decide. Now they're still the warriors, and they were
Right.
very powerful warriors.
There's a balance right
But
there.
the grandmothers are the ones that say, all right, as a last resort, we do have to go to war with this tribe. They're the ones that decide, because the grandmothers are in the internal tribal circuit. They understand how much food we need, who's sick, who's needy, who's fucking who has issues in the tribe, what are our cultural, concerns. They're tapped into that. The men, because the male ego is a little different than the female ego, they're not deciding about war. They decide about hunting and protection and all the other stuff. I thought that's a really powerful model. The divine feminine masculine sovereign is very, to my mind, very attractive as a ruler, right? Imagine if we had a Mr. and Mrs. President of the US, for example, and they had somewhat equal power. Maybe they controlled different things. They were actually in love and in a healthy, compatible, compassionate marriage and had a family.
Right.
Just imagine how different that would be if, like, they're running the country like a family or a clan, instead of like, how much money can we get by bombing these fucking people across the world and take their resources. It's like, it's a totally different world when the family and the man and woman in love are in charge of decisions that can create scarcity or abundance, life or death, rules and regulations. It's a very different world. I think one that most modern people, myself included, us included, can't even imagine, because it hasn't existed in history for such a long time. There were benevolent kings and queens in Europe in ancient times. There's stories about them. Arthur was an example, even though Arthur got cucked by Lancelot, which is kind of the
But even
tragedy of
in
that
these
story.
like more hierarchical organizations like kings and queens, we talk about earlier how usually it was the most spiritually aligned person that was the the top part of the circle, the one that was organizing and facilitating. Even the kings and queens had advisors, and who were they? They were the magicians, they were the oracles and the seers. So they still understood the need for that, but there was some kind of like dissociation from that being the place of power. Like something shifted there, right? And then you bring up a really great point, this idea of couples creating the nodes in the council and just looking at the way that the world engages with and relates to the feminine in general. Like that feminine quality of leadership has been largely subjugated. And what's happening now in the talks around the fire when it comes to spirituality and burgeoning religious, new religious practices, it's all looking back at the ways in the traditions and the cultures that really revered the feminine, not just as the female, but like the feminine energy. Like, so this is like a mass revival of this. And it's this energetic natural counterbalance coming into play. So like I feel that happening, and it gives me a lot of faith and trust in where it's all going. And they're still like, well, we're men. We got to figure out what to do with this. How we take our orders from the feminine right now. Like, where do we go to for that? And that's why I think I'm getting so deeply into these older pagan practices and like connecting more to nature and like listening deeply to the women in my life. Because as far along as I think I've come, I get into an intimate relationship where I really like, powerful engagement or conversation with a close female friend, and they'll spot something out. They'll call me out on something that just literally like guts me, and they do it so freaking well, and I can't do anything but fall on my sword and be like, yeah, you're right. And I feel all the parts of me shackling up to defend myself because I've done so much work. But man, there's so many blind spots. We gotta listen to the feminine.
Yeah, I mean, this is why all the great kings and queens of old, well, the kings especially and the warriors, the generals had an oracle. So, woman, a seer, because women
Mm-hmm.
have abilities that men don't. Their connection to nature, to women and children, to the fabric of society, and to the other world, to the creator, is just different. Their intuition works differently than men. I guess you could argue they're the same ultimately. There's more alike than more difference, which is, I think is true. But there's very powerful roles. Like the creator, God, in his or her wisdom, his and her wisdom, it's not just men or just women, it's men and women. So, of course, both should be in positions of power and leadership because both have very powerful skill sets that perfectly complement each other. That's what people forget is that, a lot of people are afraid of like a female president, right? There's all the memes that like Trump is 2-0. He's prevented two female presidents from getting in. And that would be such a nightmare if a woman was a leader. Yeah, I think those women, it would be a nightmare because those women are not like divine feminine vessels. They're
No.
corporate fucking puppets. But, women in power are interested in different things than men. And also, women have the ability to temper male egos, like you said, because they can point out blind spots, they can laugh or call out bullshit. And it's in hopefully a compassionate, feminine, nurturing way. Women can also gut you ruthlessly, right, and destroy your reputation, which we've seen plenty of that in the modern time. We do need to return to counsel, like back to this idea of counsel. Which side note, if you guys are watching this live or watching the recording, Kyle and I are hosting a council in 2 days. We'll have details for that in the comments. Private council online about this idea where we can go deeper in a private container. But like council is the way forward. Now, there are councils, right? The US has its own war council. They meet in the Pentagon and they talk about who we should bomb and airstrike and who we should control diplomatically and blah, blah, blah. Council never went away, but council has lost its ability to be transparent, to be benevolent, to serve life and nature instead of like greed or like power and control. And also, councils only have meaning if the village, the community, which, we have a pretty big village in America, it's 300 million plus, is involved in the council's decision making and there's a feedback loop. Most of the decision making in sovereignty these days, and we don't want to talk politics or government, it's all behind closed doors. We just hear about it in the news and we kind of have to just play by ear, just deal with it. This doesn't work because people feel like they're out of the loop. They're cut out of the process. That doesn't work long term because then people get resentful, they get bitter, they want to rebel, they want to revolt, et cetera, et cetera. The main way that history has moved is the conquerors take power, they oppress, they create an oppressed class who revolt, who take power out of bitterness and resentment, and then repeat step one. So it's like that cycle of history has repeated ad nauseum because now this is another spiritual idea, but I think there's some truth in it. Uh, Humanity collectively is moving through like the chakras or power centers in our collective evolution. Hey, stop. Um, got our guard dogs on duty. So like you could see like in ancient times, like, we were moving through the root. So it was all about survival. And that's what like everything was about, right? And then it was through the sacral. It was about connection and relationship and like, to some other extent, like harmony, creativity, which is the Svadhisthana, right? Now we're moving to the solar plexus, which is identity, power, and power struggles, power over, power with, control. And Christ, Buddha, all the avatars, Krishna, name your avatar, they're trying to move us up into the heart. And then you could argue, we bounce around. It's not like linear. I don't think like the chakras are like a linear totem pole. I think they're very like 3D and like, multi-phasic. But it is interesting that, we've repeated this third, if you want to say the third chakra, the Manipura, we've repeated that power identity cycle for a long time. And maybe even looped back into survival at the root, along the way.
That makes a lot of sense being in the solar plexus right now. Of course, looking at how people are so curious about who they are anymore, getting divided back down to their identity, very axiomatic division tactics. And it's a questionable thing nowadays to be like, wow, what is it to be an American now? Like everyone's up in arms around what they care about in these spaces. And I still find myself like going back to this thing we mentioned earlier around how this like shows up like in relationship. What would you say would be some of the best indicators from the work you've done with couples that help you understand like where they are at in their individual levels of like sovereignty and maturity? Because in order for a couple, let's just say, to be in a seat together on a council or to even like steward a healthy family, right, they need to work through some specific things, and that's what we're doing, like I said earlier, like, in relationship. Like, what are some of the most common patterns that you're seeing in all the work you've done with men and women together? Like, is that where they're at too? Are they also, are we individually, relationally still in the solar plexus spaces? Or is it more like the mass movement right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is very, close to home. This is a lot of my work is coaching men, women, and men and women together around relationships and communication and polarity. And, it definitely bounces around. I think a lot of people are stuck in one and two, survival and relating in general. But yeah, married couples, I'd say the trend when I work with them, it's very power and identity focused. So, women on average, I'd say now are like, I don't want to have power over me. I want to take back my power, be independent. I don't feel respected or loved by the man, blah, blah, blah. And then men, it's about, well, who am I? And I want freedom. And like, she won't do this. And, I did this and she said that. And like, it's all a communication issue usually. That's kind of the front line. And then sexuality comes in. Obviously, if sexuality isn't flowing, it affects everything else. It's a mirror for everything. But yeah, like the relationship between a man and a woman is kind of the blueprint for all other relationships. If you think about it, as children, that's where we learned, mom and dad. The village is based on families, mom, dad, and kids make up the village and community, so that ripples out. And then men and women, usually men in our timeline, take power to rule the bigger community. But it all comes back home because if their marriage isn't working, how good of a leader are they? They're not a good father or husband or wife or mother. How great are they going to be at managing resources and making decisions that affect life and death and many more people than those that just live inside their home, right? And I often talk about this. It's like, we have super intelligent AI, we've been to the moon, we go to space, we're building fucking nanobots and just crazy shit. The technology's crazy, but we haven't figured out how to relate. Like, here we are, tens of thousands of years later in the human story, and that is still a pretty open question.
Right.
You
So
know,
what's that cause for that divide? And I think about this in a larger scheme often. It's like, man, all this space travel and talk about colonizing other planets and Mars, and we still haven't even gotten too close to the depths of our own planet. Like every time someone talks about the deep sea, everyone's terrified. Like, how is that not a metaphor for doing our own inner work as a people? And so, like, how, well, that is such a rift right there. There's some massive disconnection that we're going out there and like we haven't even gone inside as a people.
yeah. I mean, one of the greatest quotes from Terence McKenna is like, we have the microscope, we can look at quantum, particles and all this shit. We have the telescope, we can see like 3 billion years into the past in the edge of the galaxy. And then we have the plants, the plant teachers. You don't have to have plants. You can do it through meditation or other altered states work. That's the microscope or telescope of the human soul and spirit in our inner world. which is the actual final frontier. It's not like we're going to go to, like, Elon literally thinks we should colonize Mars to protect the human race in case we fuck up here. That makes no sense. Like, everything that's wrong with Earth and human governments will just be exported to another planet.
Yeah.
It's just like by definition. That's not the solution. No, I don't know if it's such a bad idea. Like, if we can do it, like, fuck it. Like, I would, as a sci-fi enthusiast, I'm down to go multiplanetary as a civilization. That would be great. There is a rule in sci-fi though called the Great Filter, or you can call it the Type 1 civilization. Species can't leave their home planet until they unify and like get to a certain level. This is in Star Trek, this is in Star Wars. Like, until the human race is in some level, it doesn't mean like it's kumbaya, everything's perfect utopia, but we're on a base level where, like, hey, we actually are all brothers and sisters. Yeah, we have different clans, we fight just like families do, but we're not like genociding ourselves and destroying our home. You can't even leave your home planet. That's like the rule in the intergalactic community, right? In a lot of these sci-fis, which, hey, maybe that's how the real intergalactic community works. It's the great filter. You can't leave your home planet until you've figured shit out at home. It's like the Jordan Peterson. It's like, oh, you want to restructure the whole government and save the world? Clean up your damn room. Like, your house isn't even in order and you want to reorder society. It's like, what are you talking about? And it's the same thing with the relationship issue, intimacy, love, sexuality. You have to overcome. I mean, I'm saying this as someone practicing it and I fuck up all the time, even though I teach it as a coach. In my own relationship, it's like if I'm being selfish or I'm like self-centered or I'm not considering her or like having empathy and compassion, we're gonna enter conflict. And then that ripples into my business or ripples into my community. That's true for everyone. Like, you can be a high performer and make a lot of money, but when you go to sleep at night, if you're fighting with your wife or you feel lonely because you're divorced or single or you're in a toxic relationship, that won't fill the void. Like, we're built to bond and love, and that starts with man and woman and ripples out. So, you know, and I can hear someone saying it's not just about man and woman. Yeah, it's the same with same-sex couples though. Like, you're built to pair bond and share your life and like energy with someone, and that's one becomes two and then two becomes three with the child, and if you can't have children you can have a garden or a project, and then the three become the 10,000 things in the Taoist model, right? So like that's the holy trinity, right? It goes one, two. Two is that stable, really important state. One is obviously oneness, all oneness, aloneness. Three is the trinity. Now you have a triangle that's even more stable than two, and then you have 10,000 things. It goes infinite after that. We haven't got past one, two, three, which is why sovereignty and government doesn't work, right? To bring this full circle, like, these people aren't in loving relationships, most of them, and even the ones that are possessed by Wedico or greed or whatever, because we can assume that based on their actions.
And all these examples that we've referenced that got a lot of these things right, and they were able to organize in harmonious ways and have counsel. Going back to what Kevin mentioned, they were doing this inner work using these medicines and rituals to take a deep look at themselves and use that to inform how they're going to organize and how they're going to take care of each other and how they're going to make decisions. And let's also dispel any idea that, we can do without conflict in relationship. It's a matter of how the conflict is navigated and in what community. These people had each other and they were all doing this work together in harmonious villages and holding space for each other and having men's circles and women's circles and regular village councils and like taking care of each other, making food for each other, eating together. And so like it's there were so many parts, moving parts of this puzzle of creating sovereignty. Like, yeah, sovereignty really does indicate like, okay, come to your own power once again, the willpower, the will to be. And it only really works if everyone around you is doing it too, and you all value this ideal. And this is why I feel in the end there's so much conversation about like, let's find community, let's find tribe. It's such a trope and a meme in the new age communities, but also in every other community because it makes sense. Like that's the most necessary thing right now is to band together. And then when you band together, start practicing. You practice yourself and your partner in your community. It's a lot of fucking work. but we know it's been done before and it can happen. And that's at the heart of this conversation entirely. All these things go together.
Yeah, I
Mm.
mean, this is the most natural thing is to want to be part of a community, right? It's to want to be part of a band, a group. This is why politics is so seductive to maybe the mainstream. If I'm a Democrat or Republican, if I'm MAGA or I'm woke, I get a tribe and I get that sense of belonging. It's actually a base need. Like it's not optional. It's a survival based need. They've done horrible studies with like infants where if they don't get touch or they're not loved, they literally die even though they have food and water. Like it's that level. Exile means death in our biology, which is ancient, right? You brought up, well, this just triggered the thought. What you were saying is like Jamie Wheel, his work, one of my favorites. He does, you know, recapture the rapture and also stealing fire. He writes with Kotler about like flow states and all this epic stuff. But recapture the rapture is basically a study of like ethical cult building. He's very interested in like the Gnostics and the Greeks and all this stuff. I actually saw his talk at Burning Man one time on this. It was really, really interesting. The guy's pretty out there, and I love him though because he's an orator. But communities have to have three very important things to become a tribe or actually enter into that deep state, like you said, where ritual, inner knowledge, and like connectedness goes beyond just, hey, we voted for the same person, or we live in the same area, or we're in business together. The first one has to be catharsis. So you mentioned this earlier, like with the rituals in these Greek
Yeah.
politics, or you do this in an ayahuasca ceremony, or you do this in a group dance or group drumming, which, by the way, are the oldest ways to do it, dance and drumming. Catharsis means to go beyond oneself and release. So it's like deep tears are shed or deep laughter. Sex is a catharsis. Plant
What
teachers can be
are
a catharsis. Working out can be a catharsis. Fighting, conflict actually is cathartic. There's a sacred catharsis though, where like you literally shed your old self and experience healing. It's a physical form of healing, and this has been studied. Like your cells, your neurons, your body physically heals when you cathart deep emotion. So that's step one. Then we enter ecstasis. So ecstasis was the root of ecstasy in Greek, is going beyond oneself. Now you're in a state of bliss and you're not self-conscious. So you're not thinking about yourself and your issues and your selfish needs. You're transcending the ego in a literal, like ritualistic way. Doesn't mean it's ego death and you're enlightened. It's a temporary thing created in ritual where you go beyond that. Now, if you do that in a group field, it's extremely powerful because you're seeing people and connecting in a way beyond the mind and language. Then you enter communitas. This is what church and religion does, by the way. They do their own version of this triple. Communitas is community, but the Greek for that, it's beyond community because you feel like your hearts are tied together or connected. Because you've experienced catharsis and ecstasis together, communitas naturally forms. I mean, you've felt this in like retreats or ceremonies. Communitas, you can't create it. Be like, all right, everybody, let's agree on these rules and be a community. It's a spontaneous, non dual state where you feel the soul and understanding with other people. And in that state, you can't be bitter, resentful, angry. You can't project onto them or like fantasize or try to like compete. It's like a very interesting state that seems to be hardwired into our biology. Again, Jamie Wheel has a lot of science and neurobiology to back this up. Recapture the Rapture. This is where I'm getting these ideas. If anyone's interested in the book, that's what we need. Which is why Wheel, Schmachtenberger, just kind of name dropping all these intellectual dark web people. Um, Peterson talks about this. A lot of these guys. What's the guy's name? Vervaeke. John Vervaeke is a big proponent. The antidote to a lot of this tyranny and bullshit we see around sovereignty is actually, I mean, it doesn't have to be a religion. Some people think it should be Christianity. A lot of born again going around. We've talked about that before. But it does look religious or spiritual because those steps I just described, they're usually embedded in a spiritual ecology of practice or a religious ecology of practices. Meditation, prayer, group dance or meditation, group prayer, group music making. These are all the classic ways to do it. And then obviously the plants are like the nuclear bomb version of doing this because group plant teachers can, for anyone who's done it, you know how powerful that process can be.
And while that model, like I get it, that's true, it makes a lot of sense. It's also important to be doing that with your family and with your community. Because if you come together with a group of people that you don't know, but then you experience this great sense of like oneness in a community in this like temporal confined space, it's hard for you to fully embody and make meaning in that and to practice that if you're going back to a different community. This is why like rogue sort of retreat centers and medicine carrier communities, this is why they aren't going anywhere because people need this and they're drawn to it and they will move mountains to change their life to stay with these people. They will allow themselves to be like ungainfully employed as like indentured servants at these retreat centers, not getting paid just to show up and volunteer because they keep getting this hit of like really necessary spiritual medicine. And that can create a lot of pain. That can create a lot of challenges if these people aren't truly practicing family. They haven't done the prerequisite work to like enter in these states of, would you call it again? That last stage? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Communitas.
The communitas. A lot of people are like vaulting right towards communitas without going through the
Right.
other two stages of catharsis and ecstasis together. And this is something that's like, yeah, this is a point that's really hitting home.
I mean, I learned a lot about this studying with a bioenergetics teacher who lived with Osho and studied Wilhelm Reich and Alexander Lowen's work of bioenergetics. Extremely powerful, the most powerful non-plant teacher work I've ever done.
Mm.
It's all about catharsis and ecstasis, and communitas just arises, in these trainings and retreats I was a part of. What Osho correctly saw about Western people, this is like 60s and 70s. He's traveling to America, he's teaching in India, he had the ashram, and what's the name of that city in India? Anyway, it's in Wild Wild Country, which is one of my favorite documentaries ever. Obviously, they fucked up a lot of things with Sheila, but Osho, I think, was a master in his own way. He had his plenty of human problems. He saw Western people going to Vipassana retreats in the 60s. This is when like everyone's like, let's drop acid and fly to fucking Goa or Rishikesh, in the 60s, like our parents and older generations. And he'd see these Western people go for Vipassana. And like, if anyone's ever done Vipassana, it's pretty fucking hardcore. 10 days silent meditation, meditating 8 hours a day. I've done one and it was full on. I'll definitely do another, but like not easy. And they're sitting there pulling the grass up at these retreat centers or like clawing at themselves. Like it was actually causing psychosis in some people because if you haven't done catharsis, just sitting and observing your thoughts and feelings with how much trauma and built up programming is in the Western mind. It's in the Eastern mind too. It's just different because we have different
Different
lineages.
models. Yeah.
They needed to cathart first, which is what inspired him, so the story goes, to create his active meditations. If anyone's ever done Osho dynamic meditation or Kundalini meditation, it's pretty intense. It's a lot of like intense breathing and shaking of the body. It's all based on bioenergetics and Wilhelm Reich's work. Osho made his own, stylistic flares, of course. Done a lot of it. Extremely powerful, and it fits this model because catharsis isn't fun at first. I mean, if you have a lot of trauma, I mean, you've seen this probably with medicine work, fucking brutal. Pain and rage and sadness is just pouring out of you, almost like at an infinite level where you're scared of how intense it can be. But then what happens? Ecstasis starts to form because you start to get out of your shell and identity and breach into this level of like, you can feel connected to all things in nature and like love for your partner and your community, and like you start getting there. And then when you do this in a group setting that's safe and contained and has mentors and elders, then communitas naturally arises. You could never just create communitas by saying, hey, we're all a group and we're going to do this stuff. By the way, when you go to a Catholic or a non-denominational Christian mass, it's the same process. It's just very, it's hard to compare that to a ceremony or a meditation group. It's like you have catharsis, feel repentance for your sins or whatever. You Catharsis can also be joy and laughter. It doesn't always have to be pain. Singing and praying together, and then you go to ecstasis and your connection to God or Jesus. And then there's communitas. You break bread and eat and share together, and the community's bonded. That's why all the religious models are literally built on these steps. Every single religion follows these steps because it's worked throughout antiquity. All the ancient priests and shamans understood that people had to go through these steps to collectively heal and have vision and healing and guidance for the people, for that culture. Like this is how it's always been done. Now
Yeah,
we
and
need a new version of it though.
yeah, that's
Christianity
exactly
ain't
it.
going to cut it for the modern people. I mean, for respect to the Christians out there, but Christianity as it's been set up with its burden and momentum is not going to get it done for everyone. And that's okay. Islam's not going to get it done for everyone. Judaism, whatever, Taoism. Like we're going to have to move past. We don't have to get rid of them. I think they have treasures of value. All these religions have something valuable. But it's not going to work. Like not everyone's going to convert to like be a Shiite or a Baptist.
And I believe there are some fundamentals that we personally need to get into place first before we start engaging in any kind of community that's going right to the communitas. Like the ideas of preparation and integration, like we discussed before, they're like non sequiturs, like in community that really is holding each other. It just happens naturally when you are gradually moving through these states of spiritual development together. And so the question that I want to leave people with is like, well, where can you start? There's all this talk about personal practice, and it really is that, not to be another person talking about like get your morning practice together and make your bed, but what is it that you have done and that you can do that can start building your own foundation for this? What brings you into states of catharsis? Who do you feel safe around in your family or community that you can start doing this with, and like proactively, just like create your own circles, create your own offerings, and just seeing who shows up and like nurturing that and starting to build something from there. And if you all feel called towards something, like, okay, check it out. But bear in mind that if it's not a group of people or a set of practices that you're going to keep doing, it can cause rifts, because we're at a very sensitive time right now in the world where, yeah, we all get it. We all really need this. And a lot of us have tasted it and they just want to run right for it. But in the end, it's still about building community. And we have to tend to our inner community too, because we have a lot of hurt inner children that need to be worked with. And this is why the whole field of coaching is blowing up. Like psychotherapy is one thing, but they kind of lack the understanding of the mystical nature of this sort of work. And like people like Kevin and myself and our allies, like we have self-educated and learned in many ways how to bring this sort of ethic and conversation into relationship with our loved ones. And like this is how we're learning together. There's no roadmap. It's like you said, we're creating something new. And that's why we're having these conversations and inviting people to talk with us. Like this thing we're going to do on Wednesday, we have an idea. We have some things we're going to like put out there. We want to hear what everyone else is going to bring to the table, because we're creating it anew right now.
Yeah, brother, well said. I mean, we can end on this. I think we're kind of naturally coming to a conclusion. I had Ruthie on my Instagram asking about the born again Christian revolution. I mean, I'm open to doing an entire podcast just on that because I have a lot of thoughts on it. But I mean, like Kyle just said, like if you're watching this, later, first off, type replay in the comments so we know, or if you have any questions, hit us up. Someone was also asking who you were, and Kyle is tagged on the Facebook side. I'm also going to repost this so y'all can follow him. Um, you have to have a practice, like you said. The most basic practices are movement, prayer, meditation. Like the teacher I was talking about that I learned a lot of the stuff from, it's like she was a tantra practitioner, like classical tantra, not neo tantra, and it's sound, silence, movement, and stillness are the four elements of that alchemy. So like they're all there, right? Sound, music, singing, it's a practice. Drumming, silence, meditation, being in nature, it's a practice. Movement, weightlifting, CrossFit, martial arts, it's a practice. Just walking mindfully, and then stillness, which combines with silence really well. Meditation, yoga, qigong, tai chi, whatever. I'm just naming like some of the classics, but you have to have a practice. That's number one. Pick your own. Any practice will do if you do it. If you do the practice, you get the benefits. It's not about like watching 50. I mean, I'm guilty of this, watching 50 podcasts. Let me find a new practice to add and let me do another practice and biohack. You just need one practice. And then, yeah, you can add more later, but just practice one and then find the others. It's literally this simple. It's not easy though in our world because we're hyper connected on these devices, but people feel more alone than ever. Like, what the hell's going on? Find the others. You only need one more person. You have a dyad. That's great. We have a dyad here, right? The third person in this room is the logos or the spirit, which is like impacting. I walk into this not even knowing what we're going to talk about. Yeah, we have a couple notes and we share, but all this stuff that's happening between Kyle and I is what happens when you gather. Energy comes in and informs the field. Now, ideally, you have three people, so two other people. Now you're really cooking with a triad. Now you have a cult, and you can be the co-cult leaders or community leaders, and then you invite more people in. So you have to find the others. You can't do this stuff alone. I don't care if you live in the middle of nowhere and you think there's no one in your small town. I guarantee you can find one or two other people that share some value sets with you, and you're going to build out from there. Obviously, going to an event, working with Kyle and myself or another amazing mentor who's well networked, or you can go to a retreat or workshop, you're going to supercharge that process and have practice and community, combo dealed with you. So I definitely recommend that. All the most amazing people in my life I met at events, including you. So it's like, that's what I would recommend to everybody. And then last thing is, it's going to be in the comments. People over here, I'm going to repost it on Instagram. Um, Kyle and I are hosting a Wild Sovereign Council. It's going to be Wednesday. What are we doing? 5:30 Central? I already forgot.
Yeah, 5:30 Central.
5:30 Central time. So it's 5:30, or it's, yeah, 5:30 Texas time, Central US time. There'll be a link. It's free. Put in your email, sign up. We're gonna have we're gonna demonstrate everything we're talking about, and actually go into council and talk about these things. Do some Q&A, maybe some laser coaching hot seats. Hear from y'all. Dive in. It will be recorded if you guys can't make it. So just make sure you get your email in there, and you'll get the recording. And we'd love to see y'all there. And this is something Kyle and I are obviously very passionate about, and we want y'all to be involved and not just flies on the wall.
Yeah, come join the conversation and practice counsel with us, friends. Kevin, thanks
Let's
for
go.
joining again for another excellent conversation and looking forward to following up with you all when the time is right.
Let's go. Bless up, y'all.